So rowing is the definition of a team sport. I'm Alex Thomas. I'm a junior at the University of Scranton and a member of the men's crew team. The individual glory is gone the day you try out for this team. No one really has a free ride. It's really a commitment. You're here for a reason. Boats are divided up into 2, 4, or 8-person boats, and then the 4 and 8-person have a coxswain in them that steers them. The rowers actually have no clue where they're going because they're facing backwards, so all the trust is on that person to point us in the right direction. We're all working toward the same goal of propelling the boat through the water the best way we can. I would say the feeling of everyone being in sync with each other is a euphoric feeling because you really just feel like you're part of a machine. You're part of a team that's all working together towards the same goal. It feels like a work of art. You can't really tell when a stroke's being taken and when it's not, just kind of gliding along. When it's not, you can definitely tell it's called a check, and it's a jerking motion where you get a lot of lower back pain because you're being thrown backwards like whiplash. That feeling is very unsettling. It's very frustrating too because you might be the problem, but you're still putting that effort in. You might not know that you're the problem in it, but you could still feel that something's not right with it. It's not just working harder, it's working smarter. Learning from your mistakes, different motions that you can improve, different speeds that you can roll up on, and really listening to constructive criticism. Every single person in this boat matters. We all have a job, we all have a duty to serve. If 7 of the 8 people show up, that's great, but you're not rowing that morning. Rowing in a sport really comes down to personal commitment. You're the one setting the alarm the night before to wake up at 5 in the morning to get all your things ready the night before because you know those other people are doing the same thing. You know the person in front of you is willing to give everything that they have to get to that finish line before your opponent does. So you're doing it for yourself, but you're also doing it for the benefit of the team itself. You're putting in the hours, you're going to practice, and you're doing it for yourself and for the guy in front and back of you. It's humbled me in a way. It knocked my pride down, really taught me it's all about others. It's not about myself. I think the most important thing someone can do in this life is to humble themselves and say, hey, it's not all about me. Let's see what I can do for that person over there. This sport in general has taught me just obedience and dedication, teamwork. Everyone here is doing work. We're not passengers. No one gets a free ride in the boat. We're all here giving it our all.
That is such a cool video, and that looks like a lot of fun. I really appreciate Alex sharing his experience with us. He and his family normally attend this service. Let's just thank him for sharing his experience with us. And I love that image of a rowing team because it's such a picture of what can be accomplished with teamwork. When you get a lot of people all moving in the same direction, listening to the same voice, and all playing the part that they've been called to play, it's amazing what can happen. And I think that image is a pretty good image of what the church ought to look like. The church should be a collection of believers who are all moving in the same direction and listening to the same voice, and every single one playing the part that God has called them to play. And when you get a church full of people like that, it's a powerful thing. It's a beautiful thing. And so one of our deeply held convictions as a church, one of our core values is this, that we are crew members, not passengers. And that's what we're celebrating this weekend. That's what we're talking about this weekend, that we are called in the church not just to be along for the ride, but to actually be contributing members of the crew, to help God's work be accomplished in this world, to play whatever part He has called us to play. And this idea that we are crew members, not just passengers, that's not just something that we came up with. You see that theme all throughout the Bible. For instance, Ephesians chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. And if you grew up in church, you may be familiar with these couple of verses. It says, "For it is by grace that you have been saved from death and shame and guilt. It's by grace through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." And that's great news, that we have a relationship with God, not because we work hard enough to impress Him, not because we are so awesome, but because He is a God of grace, and we accept that gift of a relationship by faith in His Son. But you can't stop reading at the end of verse 9. You need to keep reading into verse 10, because verse 10 says this, "For In other words, all of that happened for this reason. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus, or recreated in Christ Jesus, to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. In other words, God has something in mind for you to be doing. He's got a bigger purpose for your life. He's got a bigger plan that He wants you to play a part in. And you know what? I think deep down inside, all of us want that, don't we? We all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We want to be able to look back on our lives and know that we made a difference. But then here's what happens. Our selfishness begins to kick in, and our pride begins to kick in, and we begin to listen to all of the messages of this culture, and pretty soon what happens is we begin to drift. We drift from being givers to being takers, and we become consumers instead of contributors, and we become, in the church, passengers instead of crew members. So today we want to talk about what it means for us to not just be along for the ride, because if you are a follower of Christ, if you would describe yourself as a Christian, you need to know that you follow the greatest servant in history. This is what Jesus said about Himself in Matthew chapter 20. He said, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life as a ransom for many." Two words here, I think, that define the life of Jesus: serve and give. Serve and give, which means if I'm not serving and if I'm not giving, then I'm not really following Jesus. Because to follow Him means that we live as He lived and we do as He did. And He served and He gave. So we're going to talk about that today. And the reason I want to talk about this subject is because it's so closely connected to what we talked about last week. And if you weren't here last week, I would encourage you to go online, listen to the message, and hear all the details. But I'll just give you a little bit of review. Last week, we talked about this one idea that everyone matters. Every heart matters. Every person matters. Every soul matters. And we looked at the word, as we explored this idea, we looked at the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 15. And in verse 7, He said this. He said, "There will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent." In other words, anytime one single person, one individual turns their heart to God, there's a party that breaks out in heaven. And as I said last week, this verse and Luke chapter 15 have been like an anchor point in my heart that helped me to understand what the church is supposed to be and what the church is called to do. And so around here, if you're new to the church, let me tell you this. Here in this church at Parker Hill, we want to be a church that's more than just a church for church people. We want to be a church that's more than just a church for insiders. We want to care about people who are still far from God because we believe every one matters. And then in the last part of last week's message, I talked about a kind of a big dream for our future, a big vision for the future. And I was asking this question: what if someday we could see 10,000 people on a Sunday worshiping together at Parker Hill campuses all across this region? You know, in one of the regions of the United States where there are very, very few churches, one of the spiritually most empty regions in the United States, what if someday there were 10,000 people worshiping together? Imagine, like 10 years from now on Easter, renting out the Mohegan Sun Arena and seeing 10,000 people from across this region worshiping together. Or imagine on a September Sunday, maybe 10 years from now, having church at the ballpark with 10,000 people. I mean, that would be an awesome, awesome thing. And that's a big vision. That's an ambitious vision. But let me tell you this, it's not impossible. I believe God is able. I believe God is willing. The only question is, are we willing? Because in order for that kind of a vision to ever become a reality someday, it's going to take every single one of us. In fact, let me just put it this way. It will take everyone to reach everyone. It will take all of us. It will take every one of us to reach every one of those 10,000 people. And we want to do that because we believe that every one matters. So let me tell you right up front what the goal is today. My goal today is to do this, to inspire you and to encourage you and to perhaps even prod you to get off the sidelines and get into the game, to pick up a paddle and start rowing, to move from being a passenger to being a crew member if you consider this your church. By the way, if you're a guest here today, we're glad you're here, and we'd love to have you come back again, but let me just acknowledge that what we're talking about today may not be specifically for you because we don't want something from you. We want something for you. But even as I talk in the next few minutes, I hope that you'll at least understand how important church is to us and how earnest we are about creating a church where people can find the way back to God. But let's talk about what it means from moving to passenger to crew member. And I want to begin in a passage of Scripture again this week in the book of Luke, this time chapter 10. So if you have a Bible with you, you can open up to Luke chapter 10. You can bring it up on your mobile device. You can also read the verses on the screens as we work our way through it. Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 1, here's what it says. After this, the Lord, that being Jesus, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him in every town and place where he was about to go. Now, immediately, one question that may come to your mind is this: who were these 72 others? Well, these would have been disciples, followers of Jesus. And you may think, well, wait a minute, I thought he had only 12 disciples. No, actually, he had many more than that. In fact, if you go back to Luke chapter 6, here's what it says in verse 12. It says, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray, and he spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. And so there was this inner circle of 12, and those are the guys whose names we know, like Matthew and Peter and John. But they were just part of a larger group of disciples or followers of Jesus. And so go back to Luke chapter 10. It says he appointed 72 others, these would be disciples, and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. And that raises another question. If he was about to go there anyway, why did he send them on ahead? I mean, if there was some teaching or ministry or, some kind of healing that had to be done, I mean, he could do that himself when he got there, and he would probably do a better job. But he chooses, Jesus does, to send 72 on ahead of him. And then in verse 2, he goes on to tell them why. He told them, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Now, we may not fully understand this in our culture, but in those days, if you were a farmer and you had a crop out in the field that was ready for harvest, you didn't have a combine, you didn't have a tractor, you didn't have heavy equipment. You were completely dependent upon finding laborers to reap that crop. And if you couldn't find the laborers to do it, the crop would literally rot out there in the fields. So if you had a harvest that was ready, you desperately needed people to harvest the crop for you. And so here's what was happening at this time in history when Jesus was on the scene. He had been here for 2 or 3 years, and he had been teaching the crowds, and he had been healing the sick. He had been giving people a glimpse of God's kingdom. And now he comes to this point, and he says, now, the time has come. People's hearts are ready. They are open. I want you to go out, and I want you to be the workers who reap this harvest. And as you do that, I want you to pray that there will be others in the future who will do what I'm calling you to do right now. Now, I want you to see this, because I think this tells us volumes about Jesus and about how he wants his work to be done in this world. And this really is creating a pattern for how the church ought to function for the rest of time until the end of time, over the last 2,000 years. It's kind of like these disciples, they had spent 2 or 3 years at this point walking with Jesus and talking with him and observing his life. And over those 2 or 3 years, he had been pouring into them. He had been pouring into them wisdom and truth and courage. And so now he comes to this day and he says, listen, I've been pouring into you. Now I want you to go and pour out what I poured into you. I want you to pour out what's in you into the hearts and lives of others. He says, you've been following me. Now I want you to go ahead of me. And I want you to pour out what I've given to you. He says the harvest is ready. And then he gives them one final word of encouragement. This is like the coach in the locker room just before the players go out to the big game. He says, go, exclamation point. I am sending you out like lambs among wolves. That's not very encouraging. It's like, I'm sure there's never been a coach in the history of any sport who quoted this verse in his pregame speech. But Jesus here was just trying to be honest with them. And he's saying, listen, I got to tell you right up front, as you go and do this, there will be a cost. You will have to sacrifice. It will require something from you. And let me tell you, the same thing is true today. For all those people that you saw in the video, for all the people who serve in this church, they serve And it costs them something. It costs them time. It costs them, energy. They've got to carve out of their schedule time to invest in you and in this church. It doesn't come easily, but I'll tell you this, anything worthwhile in life will cost you something. Anything worthwhile in life will cost you something. So Jesus sends out these 72. He says, listen, I've been pouring into you. I want you to go, and I want you to pour out what's been poured into you. And so they go. And then they come back to him, and they meet up later on. Verse 17, let me pick up there. It says, the 72 returned with, what's the word right here? With what? With joy, and said, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. And as I imagine this scene, I think about it kind of like, when your kids go on a roller coaster for the first time, or they go down a water slide for the first time. And at first there's that fear and there's trepidation. But then they get on and they try that thing and they get off and they say, oh man, that was awesome. And that's what these guys experienced. They went out and with some fear and trepidation. Jesus said, listen, I'm going to send you out like lambs among wolves. But they returned with joy. And they couldn't believe what they got to be a part of. Now here's what's so interesting to me. Nowhere in the Bible do you read that they listened to Jesus' teaching and they were filled with joy. Nowhere in the Bible does it say they witnessed this miracle and they were filled with joy. But it does say that when they went out and they began to serve others, when they poured out what was poured into them, they returned with joy and they couldn't even believe what they had gotten to experience. So skip down to verse 23. Then he turned to his disciples and he said, blessed are the eyes that see what you see. And for I tell you that many prophets and kings wanted to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. He's saying, listen, there have been so many kings, so many prophets, there have been many, many generations of people that were waiting and praying for God to come to his people. They would have loved to have been able to see what you're saying and hear what you're hearing. He says, you don't know how blessed you are to be a part of what God is doing in the world right now. And here's what I want you to understand. When it comes to serving other people, when it comes to pouring yourself out for the sake of other people, there is a joy and a meaning and a fulfillment that comes from that nothing else in this life will ever give to you. No other self-centered pursuit will provide that for you. In fact, this past week, here's what I did. I sent an email out to all the people in this church who serve in any capacity, and I said, hey, respond to my email and tell me what it is about serving that really is meaningful to you. And let me just read 5 of those responses. This one comes from Kim, who serves in our kids ministry. And Kim says, I can't express in words that awesome feeling I get when I see something click with one of the kids. To know that I have the opportunity to plant a seed that will one day grow and hopefully lead to a meaningful relationship with Christ is priceless. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity. I am enjoying every minute of it. Lynette wrote an email and describing some of the hardships that she'd been through in her life, physical challenges and illness and family problems. But then she said this, she said, I firmly believe that there is no greater way to get through our own trials than to serve others. And that is so true. Jeannie, who works as a greeter at this campus, she writes, I like to think that how I interact with people at the door may determine whether visitors return to Parker Hill. I feel like I'm a small stepping stone in the process of helping people find the way back to God. That's huge. Thanks for giving me that opportunity. Jill, who serves in our kids ministry with her family, she writes this. She says, I'm so thankful to be given the opportunity to serve. I really enjoy it. But watching my husband and 10-year-old son serve together in Munguland is priceless. I can see the difference it has made in their lives. Hearing the parents of the children in their classroom rave about how they love seeing Mr. Joe just melts my heart. And watching my son love on those children is so awesome. It is truly a gift from God. And by the way, if you're a parent, you're raising kids, one of the best things you can do for your kids is get them involved in serving God. And even better, serve alongside them. That will have far more positive impact in their hearts than all the baseball games and the soccer games you take them to all the time. Find a way for them to serve others and you serve alongside them. One more. This is from Tim, who works with a group of 6th grade boys. He says this, I know that God doesn't need me. The awesome thing is that he wants to work through me. He takes what little I can give and turns it into something amazing. Lives change, kids' hearts are healed, and those far from God find Him. Quite frankly, I don't understand not wanting to be in the front row to see that. My point is this: there is a blessing that comes from serving other people. When you take what has been poured into you and you pour that out into the lives of other people, it will bring you joy and meaning and purpose, and it will grow you like nothing else will. But what's interesting here to me is that we see this pattern in Luke chapter 10 in this little story that we read. And that pattern then becomes the pattern for the church over the last 2,000 years. Like Jesus, just before He leaves this world, in Matthew chapter 28, it gives His final marching orders, the final words He gave to His followers. It says, "Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me.'" Like when somebody conquers death and leaves behind an empty tomb, they have all authority. He says, "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations." In other words, now I'm not just sending you out into towns and cities and places. I'm going to send you into all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. In other words, what I have poured into you, you're going to pour into them. "And surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age." Final words to His disciples before leaving this world. And then not long after that, on what was called the Day of Pentecost, the church kind of explodes into existence in the city of Jerusalem. Acts chapter 2, Peter, you remember the fisherman who became a follower of Jesus. He's standing up before a crowd of people in the city of Jerusalem. This is about 33 AD. And it says, with many other words he warned them, and he pleaded with them, "Save yourselves from this corrupt generation." Those who accepted his message were baptized, and get this, about 3,000 were added to their number in one day. You know, we talk about reaching 10,000 people. This is 3,000 people in one day. So what happened when these people accepted the message and went public with their faith through baptism? What had to happen then? Well, verse 42 tells us. It says, "They devoted themselves, these new believers, to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer." They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. So here's what happened. Jesus is gone. And so these 12, the apostles, the inner circle, they begin to pour themselves out into the lives now of thousands of believers, teaching them, it says. And it says in the book of Acts, they met together every single day. So they took what had been poured into them in the 2.5, 3 years they spent with Jesus, and they began to pour that out into others. And then you keep reading through the book of Acts. And as you keep reading, you run into the story of a guy named Paul. Now, Paul has a fascinating story. Paul spent the first part of his life persecuting Christians, hunting them down, dragging them off, throwing them into prison, sometimes seeing that they were actually killed. And so one day he's on his way to a city called Damascus to do more of the same, to find some more Christians. And God stops him in his tracks. He has this incredible conversion. He's brought to his knees literally, and he becomes a follower of Christ, no longer hating Christians and persecuting them. Now he's leading them. So what happens to Paul? Well, all of these believers then surround him, and they see the potential in him, and so they begin to pour into him. And you read their names in the New Testament of the Bible, people like Barnabas, who encouraged him, and John Mark and Silas, people who came alongside of him because they saw his leadership potential, and what had been poured into them, they poured it out and poured it into his life. And then Paul began to pour himself out into the lives of many, many people. Many people. And if you read through the New Testament, there are 27 books in the New Testament. 13 of them were written by Paul. They're letters written to those first century Christians in those churches. And as you read those letters, here's what he's doing. He's pouring himself out to those people. What had been poured into him was now poured out to them. But then there's one young man in particular named Timothy. And Paul meets Timothy as he begins to travel throughout the known world at that time, starting churches and advancing God's kingdom. And he meets Timothy, who's young and still single, kind of living at home in his parents' basement. And Paul begins to build a relationship with him, and he says, "Timothy, why don't you come along with me and help me do God's work?" And they travel together, and for about 2 years, Paul just pours himself out into the life of this young man named Timothy. And then toward the very end of his life, this is the last letter that he ever wrote, Paul writes this to young Timothy. He says, "You then, my son," that's how close they were, "be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others. In other words, he says, Timothy, what you've heard from me, what I poured into your life, Timothy, after I'm gone, because I'll be gone soon, I want you to take what I have poured into you, and I want you to pour that into the hearts of other reliable men who will then someday be able to pour that into other people's hearts as well. And so this then becomes the pattern throughout the last 2,000 years for how God's kingdom has advanced, how faith has passed on, how the church has grown. And that's true in my life as well. The reason I'm here is because there have been people in my life who poured into me. And here's what happens around here every single Sunday. There are hundreds of people who have decided, you know what, I'm going to take what was poured into me and I'm going to pour that out into the hearts of other people. And so there are people parking cars or greeting people as they come in, and they're just pouring some encouragement into the hearts of people who come and helping them to feel welcome. And there are people who work with our kids who are pouring love and truth into the hearts of those kids. There are musicians up on this platform and technicians back in the booth who are pouring out inspiration as we work together. And every week, Sunday after Sunday, hundreds of people who just said, you know what, I'm going to take what was poured into me and I'm going to pour that out for the sake of someone else. So here's my question. Who are you pouring into? Who are you pouring into? And here's why that's such an important question. Number one, because someone needs you. See, the reason we would set aside a Sunday to talk about this is not because a church needs you. Not because an organization needs you. The reason we would talk about this is because this person needs you. This person needs you to pour out what's in you and pour it into them. And I don't know who this person is. This may be a little girl who's a part of our children's ministry who comes to church because her grandmother brings her because her own home life is so broken and so dysfunctional, and she just needs somebody in her life who will pour into her heart some love and some encouragement and give her an anchor for life. This may be a single mom with 3 kids in tow every Sunday when she shows up. And she just needs somebody out there in the parking lot who's going to help her and assist her and help her to get inside, help her to get the kids in the class so that she can come in here and just get a break and just learn and grow. And she just needs somebody to pour in some encouragement and love into her heart. This may be a middle school boy who's just on a path that's going to take him nowhere good. And he just needs a godly man in his life who will pour some wisdom and some truth and some love into his heart and totally change the trajectory of his life. See, you need to be pouring out because someone needs you, but this is true as well. You need this. You really do. I am fully convinced that no Christian can continue to grow and become the person they need to be if all you do is take, and never give out. See, you can come here Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, and you can be poured into, but here's what's going to happen eventually. Eventually, you won't be able to receive any more truth, and God really won't be able to get through to your heart because you become stagnant and you become ingrown, and you're only concerned about yourself. And until you're willing to pour out, God can't really pour into you. And I believe with all my heart that you never will become the person God is calling you to be until you're willing to pour out what has been poured into you. Now, let me end by just addressing 3 groups of people. First group of people I want to address is those of you who've already found a place on the crew. You're already serving. You're no longer a passenger. To you, let me just say thank you. It's because of you that we as a church have been able to make the impact that we've been able to make here in northeastern Pennsylvania. Thank you for serving. And it's because of your serving in this church that lives are being changed and stories are being rewritten and God's kingdom is being advanced. And I wish I could sit down over a cup of coffee with every single one of you who serves and just say thank you personally for what you're investing, for what you're pouring out. It comes at a cost. There's sacrifice involved, but it's worth it. And there's a joy that comes in that. Second group would be those of you who are serving, but maybe God is prompting you to take on a little bit more responsibility, because you've got more that you can pour out. And maybe you sense God nudging you to take on a leadership role or a teaching role and to move into a greater and higher level of serving others because He's given you the giftedness and the capacity to do that. And if that's the case, we're always looking for great leaders, volunteers who can lead other volunteers. And we'll find somebody to fill the spot where you're currently serving if you're ready to take on an even greater level of responsibility. Third group I want to speak to is those of you who are not yet serving, not yet part of the crew. And I just want to say this to you. It will cost you something, and you will have to give up some time, but you need to do this because someone else is depending on you and because your heart depends on it. And I just want to encourage you. Get off the sidelines. Get into the game. Don't just be a passenger in the boat. Pick up a paddle, because this church will never be the church that God is calling us to be if we end up with a church full of passengers and not crew members. So let me tell you how you can take that step. On your chair, as you came in, there was a card. It looks like this. Go ahead and take that out. I'm just going to walk you through it. So get that in front of you. There's a pen nearby. If you need a pen, get that card in front of you. I'm going to tell you how this works. There's a real easy process we have for you to let us know that you may be interested in finding a place to serve, to being a part of the crew. Okay? So start on the side that says, where would you like to serve? And even though, let me say this, even though we've got over 700 people who are serving, we still have over 300 open opportunities. 300 of them. So first box that you see there, guest services. If you love people and like to make them feel welcome and you have a warm personality and a good smile, that might be a great place for you to serve. As I've said before, most people make up their minds about whether they're ever coming back to this church long before they ever hear me up on the platform. It's based on how they're welcomed when they come. The next area is music and production. If you're very skilled at playing a musical instrument or singing, or you're very skilled with the technology that goes along with that, we'd love to hear from you. And maybe right now you're using that ability to play in a club on Saturday nights. I would just encourage you to use it for something that really matters, leading other people in worship. So let us know if you have some skill in that area. The next box says next steps. That's a way for you to help other people navigate their spiritual journey and to grow. Ministry support. That's serving behind the scenes, cleaning buildings, helping out in the office, things like that. Then the last four boxes, Mungu Land, Epic Kids, Student Ministries, and Kids Jam, those are all opportunities to pour yourself out for the sake of the next generation, to pour into the hearts of people in their most formative years of life. And I'll tell you what, there are few things more rewarding than that. And I got to tell you, I am so thankful for the family ministries of this church. I've been here 27 years. I've raised my kids in this church, and they are thriving spiritually. And it's because of so many people who give of their time to invest in the lives of the next generation. That may be a great place for you to serve. So all you have to do is this: check a box or a couple of boxes. Then on the other side, give us your contact information and tear that off. And we're going to drop that in the offering buckets in a few minutes. Now, let me tell you what this isn't. This is not a commitment, okay? This is an expression of interest. This is, hey, I might be interested in this. I'd like to know more. So you're not committing yourself to anything. But here's what we'd like you to do. Fill that out, drop it in the offering bucket, and then in 9 days, we're having something called Crew Orientation, June 2nd, 7 o'clock. And here's what that is. If you come, get free food, get to hear from your campus pastor about what serving is all about and why it's important. And then you can meet some of the ministry leaders, walk around the building, see the area where you might serve. And then that night you can make a decision if you're ready to take that step. But this is just an indication of interest. So here's what this is all about. This isn't about filling a slot. This isn't about signing up for something. This isn't about being on a list. This is about all of us being on mission. And our mission is to help people find the way back to God and then take their very next step in following Him. It's the most important mission in the world. See, the thing that's going to change this world is not the government, it's the gospel. And if we will get serious about this, I believe our best days are ahead of us. I believe we have a great open door of opportunity here as a church in northeastern Pennsylvania, but it's going to take every single one of us. Now, you might be looking for a church where you can just come and sit and soak it all in. And if that's the case, there are lots of churches out there like that. We just don't ever want to be one of those churches because there's way too much at stake.